This is Bennett Island. It's just a rocky, icy outcropping north of Siberia that looks like nothing more than a frozen cliff face rising from the Arctic Ocean. As you might imagine, this is one of the last places on Earth you'd want to be stranded. In 1902, an esteemed Russian scientist was exactly that, left stranded on this island. So this is his horrifying ordeal, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. In the winter of 1903, the chill over the Russian Empire wasn't just from the snow and cold. It was the growing fear that one of their most esteemed scientists, Baron Edward von Toll, had vanished somewhere in the Arctic's white void. Months had passed without any word from him, and the last anyone had heard, he and 3 companions were in good health, camped on Bennett Island. This is an island north of the Siberian mainland, and at that point they were planning their return to the mainland. That note had been dated October 26, 1902, and since then there had been nothing but silence, and so the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences was panicking. Edward wasn't just another explorer chasing a dream, he was a respected geologist, a baron, and a symbol of national pride. Losing him wasn't just a tragedy, it was a scandal, and so someone had to go after him. That someone would end up being 29-year-old Naval Lieutenant Alexander Kolchak. Alexander was ambitious, sharp, and driven by a fierce loyalty and had served under Edward during the expedition that caused Edward to become lost in the first place. This meant he knew the region well, he knew all the risks, and he knew the odds of success were against him, but that didn't matter. When the Academy called for volunteers, Alex stepped forward without hesitation. Now, in the lead up to all of this and prior to the expedition leaving, Edward was no fool. He wasn't some wide-eyed wanderer throwing himself at reckless pursuits. Again, he was a respected scientist, and he was also deliberate and deeply rational. Even rational men, however, aren't immune to obsession, and Edward's was Zemla Sanikova. For decades, rumors had swirled in Arctic circles of a mysterious land glimpsed beyond the New Siberian Islands. Hunters spoke of a dark silhouette on the horizon of a landmass that no map showed. One explorer, Yakov Sanikov, claimed to have seen it while crossing the ice in 1811. He marked it down on his map and gave it his own name, Sanikov's Land. This sliver of a rumor and the legend that grew around it was all Edward needed. He was convinced it existed. And beyond it existing in the first place, he thought it might hold the key to understanding the Arctic's geology, maybe even a kind of last refuge of life from a previous era. So in 1899, when the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences invited him to lead an expedition to the New Siberian Islands, Edward didn't hesitate and he accepted immediately. After he accepted, construction began on the Zarya, which was a sleek hybrid vessel that was part sailing ship and part steam-powered icebreaker. This was custom built for Arctic travel. It would be both a home and a lab for the crew and scientists. Then on June 21, 1900, the Zarya slipped away from St. Petersburg with Edward at the scientific helm and Lieutenant Nikolai, a seasoned Arctic navigator, in command of the ship. They would then travel west around Scandinavia before circling back up north toward the Arctic. And at first, things were cordial. Nikolai respected the chain of command and Edward respected Nikolai's experience, but their relationship quickly soured. Before long, the tension between them reached a tipping point as the Zarya wintered on Bonnevay Island about halfway across Siberia. Edward then stripped Nikolai of command and promoted the more agreeable Lieutenant Fyodor Madison. Amid these tensions and personnel changes, another officer separated himself from the others and rose to the occasion and became indispensable to the expedition. This was Alexander, the very same man who would volunteer to rescue Edward several years later. He was a naval man and a researcher, and in April 1901 he joined Edward on a sledge journey to trace the mouth of the Taimyr River. This would be another landmark on their slow creep across the northern Siberian shores. As spring turned to the high north summer, the ice began to melt, but it wasn't until September that the Zarya could even attempt to move again. Edward then pushed onward towards Zemla Sanikova and reached somewhere around the larger landmass south of where it was supposed to be. This is a set of islands right between the Laptev Sea and the East Siberian Sea. However, surprisingly quickly, even he was beginning to concede that maybe the island wasn't where it was supposed to be. He then switched his attention to something real, which was Bennett Island. Bennett Island is also north of these islands and conveniently not far from where Sanikov's Phantom Land was supposedly located. Edward reasoned that maybe Sanikov's land had been a mirage. Maybe it was Bennett Island all along, seen at a strange angle under a strange light. It was a stretch, but Edward was running out of time and out of ice-free months. And already, despite freeing the ship and scouting the area a little bit, thickening ice floes forced the Zarya to winter once more, this time on Kotelny Island, about 186 miles or 300 kilometers from Bennett Island. Over the course of the winter, Edward began to plan a dog sled expedition. he planned to leave in spring and instructed the Zarya to try to reach Bennett Island by the summer to meet him. If they couldn't get there by September 3rd, 1902, he would return to the mainland alone. Edward set out from Kotelny Island in June 1902 with 3 men, sleds packed with supplies, dogs, and limited ammunition. Edward knew the Zarya was supposed to meet them on Bennett Island, but the window for the ship to move was ridiculously small. The ice had to melt, but not too quickly, the winds had to shift, but not too harshly, and nature, as usual, didn't cooperate. Throughout July and August, Fyodor and the Zarya crew waited for the ice floes to break up. When the thaw finally came though, a period of heavy wind pushed the block where the Zarya was moored far off course, forcing them to spend days regaining their position. Then when they finally got moving again, they tried hugging the northern coast of Kotelny Island, but they were stopped by heavy ice. They then tried the southern route and made better progress until they hit another wall. As September loomed, Fyodor gave it one final shot. With time running out and fuel stores dwindling, he steered the Zarya back north one last time toward Bennett Island. Again though, the ship was halted by impassable floes, and this time there would be no more chances. The Zarya had reached the end of its line. The ship was too low on coal to continue and too far from safety to risk staying frozen in. So, with heavy hearts, Fyodor and the crew turned back, leaving Bennett Island behind them and Edward with it. Admirably though, they didn't quit outright. The Zarya crew may have been battered and cold, but they weren't about to leave one of their own without a fight. Even after abandoning the push for Bennett Island, they left men behind to wait at various points, hoping Edward might eventually appear. One man was left on the Fedayevsky Peninsula, then another man remained at Cape Vysoky, supplied and ready in case Edward returned. The weeks, however, soon turned to months with still no sign of him. So by December of 1902, unfortunately, the bulk of the crew returned to St. Petersburg after abandoning the Zarya on the northern coast of the Siberian mainland. They gave the reports that scientific progress had been made and the Arctic had been mapped, but the man who started it all was still out there somewhere, maybe alive and maybe not. And upon their return, the Academy of Sciences was torn. Some believed Edward must be dead, others couldn't accept that. And so on December 9th, 1902, they gathered to decide what to do next, and Alex and Fyodor were summoned to weigh in. Fyodor, having witnessed the futility firsthand, advised against any further action. According to him, it was too dangerous, but Alexander wasn't ready to bury Edward just yet. He had no illusions about the Arctic. He had been there and seen it in action, but he also knew Edward, and he couldn't shake the image of a man still alive out there, stubbornly pushing south through snowstorms, surviving on instincts and scraps, and waiting for rescue. So, when the Academy hesitated, Alexander stepped forward and offered to lead a new expedition, one that wouldn't rely on ships or theoretical windows of thawing. Instead, they'd go overland with sleds and a whaleboat. They'd follow the trail by muscle, by dog, and by sheer determination. The plan was practically insane, and yet somehow it was approved. By mid-January 1903, Alexander had received funding and official backing. He then sent a telegraph to his fiancée, postponing their upcoming wedding before packing up and heading for the ice. By the time Alexander officially took command of the 1903 rescue expedition, it was already clear that this wasn't a routine trip. The ice was melting unpredictably, the Zarya was abandoned, half the Academy didn't think the rescue would succeed, but Alexander didn't care. For him, failure wasn't an option because in his mind, Edward wasn't dead. After leaving, he first headed to Mezin and the White Sea coast, where he began recruiting men tough enough to face what lay ahead. He then recruited 6 Pomors, who were the seasoned local coastal hunters who knew how to survive in Siberia and read the ice. These men apparently didn't flinch when told they'd be hauling sleds and boats across frozen wastelands. They just nodded, packed their gear, and showed up on time to leave. After that, he was also soon joined by 2 veterans of the Zarya, Nikifor, the expedition's boatswain, and Vasily, the helmsman. Nikifor, given his experience, didn't waste time sugarcoating things. He flat out told Alexander that hauling new boats from Mezin was a waste of effort. Instead, he convinced him to salvage an old whaleboat sitting near the abandoned Zarya at Tiksi Bay. This is the bay almost directly southwest of Bennett Island on the Siberian mainland. As they made their way eastward afterward, logistics were a nightmare as Alexander had to source dogs, sleds, food, ammunition, and Arctic gear, all while racing against the clock. Even still, by early March, all 17 members of the expedition had convened in Yakutsk. It was there that the true expedition began. They then traveled down the Alden River and its tributary, the Nera, until they reached Verkhoyansk. Then another month later, on April 10th, they arrived in the village of Kazachi on the Yana River. It was there that Alexander got bad news. There were apparently problems securing the whaleboat at Tiksi Bay, and without it, the rescue might fail even before it began. He then rushed to the bay, hoping to solve the problem himself, but when he arrived, he found that someone had beaten him to it. The whaleboat was secured, waiting and ready, and so was Fyodor of all people. It's not entirely clear if Alexander knew he'd be meeting Fyodor, or if this was just a coincidence, but he certainly must have been a sight for sore eyes. Fyodor was apparently there to oversee the ship's final dismantling and sail. Shortly afterward, with the whaleboat secured and loaded, the dogs fed, and the men prepared, Alexander turned north again toward Bennett Island. By early May 1903, the expedition reached the northernmost settlement on the Siberian mainland. From there was no more land beyond it, only ice, wind, and the far-off promise of the islands they'd been to the year before. And on May 5th, Alexander and his team crossed into that frozen unknown. 17 men and 10 sleds, each pulled by 13 dogs. Then among them, the whaleboat was literally pulled across the ice on 2 massive sledges, requiring the brute force of 30 dogs and a handful of grumbling men. And despite the incredible endurance they're known for, given the difficulty, the dogs refused to work more than 6 hours at a time. Unfortunately, the humans didn't have that luxury. Movement also actually happened at night when the ice was firmer. By day, they rested in makeshift camps, and at any time the temperatures could drop low enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a war of attrition fought against cold, time, and exhaustion. On May 23rd, they reached Kotelny Island once again and stopped to regroup. The ice wasn't ready for boats yet, so they hunted to supplement their supplies and prepared the whaleboat for open water. During this, they spent most of their time skinning seals, mending gear, and staying alive. Weeks passed and the ice groaned and cracked under their feet, but finally, by July 18th, the waters began to open. It was finally time, and the team then split into 2. A forward group of 7 set out first in the whaleboat, scouting a path through the ice fields. The others then followed in stages. Sailing was impossible in many places, so they rowed. When they couldn't row, they dragged, and where they couldn't drag, they waited for nature to give them a break. Along the way, they also stumbled on fragments of the past expedition, and not just supplies. On July 26th, they found the man left at the Fadiyevsky Peninsula. He was still manning his lonely outpost and waiting for a sign from Edward. Disturbingly though, there hadn't been one. Then, farther ahead on Cape Vyasoki, they found the other man who had been stationed to assist Edward should he return. He was still there, tending to a camp like a man trapped in a pause moment. But again, there was no word or sign from Edward. The party spent a day resting at the camp before pressing on. From there, they sailed through increasingly open waters using oars and sails, navigating between chunks of drifting ice. Then on August 4th, they finally reached their destination of Bennett Island. Alexander then set foot on the island Edward risked everything to reach. It was essentially a sheer, icy, rocky cliff almost all the way around except for a few flatter areas. It was wild, wind-battered, and hauntingly empty, but just moments after reaching Cape Emma on one side, they made a discovery. It was a bottle, and inside the bottle was a note and a map. After months of chasing him, here was a bottle tucked into the rocks with Edward's unmistakable handwriting inside. It had been waiting there for nearly a year, sealed against the elements. Using the map, Alexander, Nikifor, and one of the other expedition members set off to locate Edward's last known camp. They then navigated across the fractured ice, jagged terrain, and pushing deeper into the island's interior. And during this, while leaping over a crevasse in the ice, Alexander misjudged the distance and plunged into the freezing Arctic water. He was then pulled out, soaking wet and half frozen, and immediately stripped down and redressed by his men. As horrifying as this might have been to most people, this was hardly an incident, and the group kept moving. Then finally, they reached the camp on the far side of Bennett Island, and Alexander found what he had come for, but not in the way anyone had hoped. There were no people, no footprints, and no bodies, just more relics. Scattered around the makeshift shelter were scientific instruments, boxes of geological samples, and a partially buried diary. Alexander then read every line of it, and it confirmed what the note hinted at. It said that Edward and 3 of his companions had reached Bennett Island on July 21st, 1902. They found that the land was surprisingly rich in wildlife, including reindeer, Arctic birds, and bears. In theory, this should have been more than enough to sustain them. And for weeks afterwards, they lived off the land, and food wasn't a problem, at least not at first. This was where a crucial mistake was made. Instead of setting up long-term provisions and fortifying their camp, Edward bet everything on the Zarya arriving again. By the time they realized the ship wasn't coming, it was already late October. Their ammunition was nearly gone, the reindeer had migrated, and the sea was freezing over. They then made a decision that still baffles historians to this day. They left. Edward's final diary entry was dated October 26, 1902, and read, quote, "Today we start on the return trip south. Our traveling supplies are good for 14 to 20 days. We are all in good health," end quote. And that was it. No more notes, no other final words, just a calm confidence in the face of impossible odds. Alexander then spent 3 days scouring the island, only to find nothing. There was no sign of what happened to Edward and his men. It was like they'd simply been erased by the wind. And once they were satisfied that they'd searched every inch of Bennett Island, Alexander made the call no one wanted to make. It was time to go. The men had risked everything to come here, but the trail was gone and the Arctic was shifting again. Alexander and his men then turned south again. There was no ceremony or moment of reflection, just a boat pushed off the island shore on August 7th, 1903. They then reached an old camp on the larger islands by August 14th and rested there for 3 days. And the men were weary, but not just from the physical grind, but from the defeat they had met at every turn. They had traveled thousands of miles through frozen hell to find that they might never get answers. Alex then decided to complete one last survey of the larger islands, hoping for any sign that Edward had made it off Bennet Island alive. But again, he found nothing, no shelters, no sled tracks, and no more notes and bottles. And fall was coming fast now and the ice was forming again. Soon, open water would be hard to come by, and in fact, they would end up having to wait nearly 2 months for the sea to freeze solid enough to resume travel by sled. Finally, in early December, the ice was solid, so they began on sleds once again. Alexander continued forward with the last leg of the expedition looming before him, and then, in Kazachi village, something surreal happened. Amid the bitter cold, Alexander found his fiancée waiting for him. She made the journey to meet him, not knowing if he was alive or if he even made it to Bennet Island, but there she was, bundled and pale, with news that was surprisingly desperate. Apparently, the Academy of Sciences, she said, had lost hope. They'd all but written the expedition off, and there had actually been talk of calling it back, but the communication had failed to reach them. For weeks, no one in the capital had known where Alexander was or if he was still alive at all. He had risked everything to bring news back, and no one was even sure if he was coming. Luckily, this wasn't the case, so on January 26, 1904, Alexander reached Yakutsk and wired his report to St. Petersburg. In it, he explained that Edward had reached Bennet Island and survived there for more than 3 months. Then, for reasons that are not entirely clear, he left and likely died while crossing the ice to the mainland. Upon getting this information, newspapers printed Edward's last note in full, and scientists pored over Alexander's findings. The public then mourned the loss of a man who had devoted his life to finding a land that probably never existed in the first place. As for Alexander, he kept moving forward. Now, it's never entirely clear how well a sense of time is established throughout these stories, but in this case, they were apparently gone long enough and hope was bad enough that he'd almost been forgotten about. Upon his return, though, his name was suddenly everywhere, attached to one of the boldest Arctic operations Russia had ever mounted. As for Edward, there were no grand pronouncements or poetic epitaphs, just a factual note in his diary and a quiet vanishing into the Arctic. The island had provided enough to live, but not to last, and by the time they realized they had waited too long to leave, the choice was gone. They could either stay and starve or walk out into the cold and hope to reach salvation on foot. In the end, they chose the latter, and it was probably the last choice they ever made. By contrast, Alexander's expedition, although it failed to find the men alive, was considered a resounding success. It returned without the loss of a single life, and it brought back scientific samples, cartographic data, and precious insights into the treacherous conditions of the new Siberian islands. More than that, however, it honored Edward and closed the story with truth and not myth. As a result, in 1906, Alexander was awarded the Constantine Medal by the Russian Geographical Society, which was its highest honor. And in the end, following the 2 expeditions and decades later, the truth was finally learned. Edward had died chasing a place that didn't exist. In the 1950s, American satellite imaging confirmed that the Zemlya Sannikova was a mirage. It was simply atmospheric trickery, just a convincing reflection on the horizon.